Okay, great. So welcome everyone. We are joined here by Jin L.C. who is an assistant professor in the School of Computer Science at McGill and an associate member at Mila. Her research lies in the intersection between software engineering, human-computer interaction, and artificial intelligence. Her recent projects in particular focus on software traceability, open source software usability, and software documentation. She received her Ph.D. in computer science and engineering from the University of Notre Dame. And welcome, Jin. We're really excited for your talk.
Thank you, Jess, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. So as always, I'll use some time to set up my screen so you can take the time to settle down and prepare your question if you already have any. So host, please. So let me know if you're able to see the slides.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So the title of the talk is Towards Developing Accountable, Usable, and Inclusive Software. And before I start to discuss all those fascinating topics, I'd like to just give a brief introduction of the lab. So at McGill, specific at SOX, I co-lead the software technology lab with Professor Martin Rubia, who's also here in the audience. And we have worked with a bunch of amazing students in the past years. And this is pre-COVID, so we're able to take pictures. So if we're taking pictures now, probably a lot of them will just have the popped up Zoom windows. But yeah, just let me show better pictures than the Zoom windows. Those are currently the lab members. I'm very, very fortunate to work with them to explore a wide range of fascinating topics. So as just introduced, my area is really embedded into the intersections between three bigger directions. And those are the software engineering, human-computer interaction, and artificial intelligence. And between those different angles, we're exploring more specific topics that really requires us to either use methodology from different disciplines or the problem itself are embedded into certain discipline. So the topics including open source usability and user engagement, which I'm going to talk about today. And I'm also going to talk about the documentation practice. There's other topics I'm been very interested in exploring as well. And some of my students here, so they know that I've been really interested in working with the traceability generation and explanation, and the open source issue discussion, summarization, and the open source contributors recommendation. And recently, we've been working very closely to the machine learning for code. So if you are interested in that, you are very welcome to join what does the reading groups, Machine Learning for Code and Mila. So yeah, so I don't know how many of you have had some software engineering background. But if you have implemented certain software in the past, you probably, the first thing you think about what to implement is probably the requirement, the functional requirement, what kind of functions the piece of code is trying to achieve. But that is not Snow White, but we have a large number of teams that is together forming the requirement space. So those are the things that is not too much about how the functions is, but how those functions can be achieved in what kind of quality. So those things including the maintainability, for example, reliability, security, auditability, etc. So today we would like to talk about two of them, which tend to be overlooked by a lot of people, especially in the domain of open source, which is my focus for the first direction. So usability, and the other direction is about documentation. I would like to really think this talk should be interactive. So I'm going to ask you a lot of questions. So don't feel shy. Directly speak up or raise your hand either way, or use the chat, whichever works for you. And if you have any questions, also feel free to interrupt me at any time. So I have to start by asking you some questions. And the first question is, what open source software do you use, or to different spectrum of use? Do you use it daily, or you cannot live without, or at least you're using very frequent?
SSH.
SSH? Yeah. Anyone else?
Is it Zotero, the one with the links to
Yes.
pages to keep them organized? Yeah, that one's nice.
Yes.
In the chat, we have Firefox, Linux, VS Code.
VS Code. This is amazing. Yes. So yeah, personally for me, Zotero, Thunderbird, VS Code, those are the things that I'm open almost all the time on the background. So seems that it's widely used and it's basically a supporter for our daily academic life and other different kind of lives too. So the second question is, what would you do when you encounter problems when using those software?
I Google.
You Google?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Stack Overflow.
And what else? Yeah, Stack Overflow, a lot of them. But for some, so yeah, people say that to resort to the documentation. But if none of them can help your questions, switch. That is, yeah. Yeah, that is the spectrum when you cannot really find the problem. Have you tried to contact the developers? Since this is open source. Have you tried to use the issue tracker if they have any to raise your questions? Yeah, some people said that opening issues on GitHub, right? So this is maybe for, we are the CSGS audience, so a computer science graduate student. So this is probably some intuitive channels to communicate with them if you cannot find your answers from the documentations, nor from the Stack Overflow or Google search. And this is not that intuitive if you don't have this background. If you are not familiar with Git, you don't know how this open source software development works. So a lot of them, they probably are going to look into the place where they download the software first. So the end users without very sophisticated CS background, this is where the first thing they're going to look at. And they, a lot of times, they don't put the GitHub links into the very obvious place. So that makes the communication between the end users and the developers quite convoluted. And even if you manage to find the GitHub issues, you probably, if you have submitted issue before, if you have looked at some issues already, you probably know that it's not a place that is only facing the end users, actually far from it. You're going to encounter the project owners. You're going to encounter the other contributors who are helping the code base. You're going to experience the bug reporters who've been pretty frequently knows how to report a bug, or some people who are reporting bug, but not very well formally following the template. And the end users who are simply browsing, they just try to find a solution for their current problems, but they don't want to make the hassle of making some comments. So in our previous study, we actually analyzed what kind of information are embedded in the issue trackers from GitHub. And our students and I and collaborators, we analyzed those content and the category of this content together. And we realized that instead of single type of content, actually it's a rich categories of information that can serve different kind of stakeholders. So you can see that, I don't know if it's very clear to you, you have the discussion of the solutions, how to fix the bug, what kind of motivations, why do you want to do that, and some of the task tracking, the solutions to the use case of the solutions, and some social chat, etc., etc. So this kind of information, if there's no specific support, it is really hard for the end users to figure out what to do with this kind of information. It's even hard for the contributors already, not to mention end users. So this daunting way of communicating is really causing trouble for their voice being heard, especially the problems related to usability. So consider that they have a bug, they need to put it there and they need to fix in order for the next version to move forward, versus some comments like this. Can I please have this function of hiding the buttons in the tab bar line and in the panel title bar, please? So this is a usability problem. And they posted there for VS Code in 2018. And there's, yeah, 4 years already passed. There's 87 comments, and the latest comments is actually 22 days ago. It says, oh, please we get constant requests, questions about this one. It's very annoying. Is there any progress? Why it is holding back? But it just not being resolved. Those kind of usability issues has been constantly put into the backlog. So what we are thinking is that, can we do better? And to make the user, the end user's voice being heard in those kind of issue trackers. This is our first step. So think about, if you want to make certain things happen, normally you probably won't just to say a claim, right? You probably want to think some strategies to put the claims there so that it's more convincing. So actually there is a model called Argumentation Model that is help people to structure their claims so that it's well supported, it's reasonable, people have an easier time to accept it. So this claim need to have different supporting structures to make it more convincing. And this is called Tolman's model. And this model of argumentation have been used in different areas, for example, in legal form and in helping people to do the more analytic writings. And actually people have used it to write the usability evaluation before for not open source software. And the structures are including, to support the claim, there are ground, that is basically the facts that you can use as a foundation to support the claim. And you have the warrant, that is some of the general or hypothetical statements. So that acts as a bridge between the data and the claim. And there are rebuttals. So in the cases that if the warrant is not applicable, you can use that to rebuttal the claim. And there's some backing up additional data to demonstrate the validity of the warrants. So there are some of the concrete examples. If you're thinking what kind of claim, for example, it's we should hire Steve. And the ground is that Steve has extensive experience in user interaction design. And the warrant can be something like user interaction design is really important. It can increase the revenue. And so that we presumably should hire Steve. And the rebuttal information basically is a distractor that, for example, Steve actually have some other issues so that we should not hire Steve. So that counterfacts the claim. So our work is really thinking that, can we help the end users to use this kind of richer structures instead of plainly putting there, but they can structure their argumentations better so that their voice, their problems can really be heard. So this model is a complete model, but when we analyze our data, that what actual people have put in there in the issue tracker, we in the end go to a more simpler version. So the most important elements into a valid argumentation model is the claim, the ground, and the warrant. So for each issue thread, we analyzed the issue threads and to see what kind of elements they can fulfill in this argumentation model. So we find that overall, there's a big level of classification. So basically, you have the argumentative content, you have the non-argumentative content. So in the previous slides, you probably see that the richer categories of information types in the issue trackers, there's some social chats, and those things are not relevant to the argumentations for them. And for the ones included in the argumentation elements, we have the supporting side, we have the against side, and each side can have a claim to vote for some certain features or vote against certain features. And to support that argument, you will have the ground and the warrant. So we analyze a corpus of more than 5,000 quotes, and we analyze with the content and different categories it appears, and to see if this kind of information can be possible to support the user to make their arguments. And we spend a lot of times with my students to work on this, to make the annotation, which is very, very manual intensive. So we also propose to use machine learning techniques to help us to reach these classifications to a level of accuracy that is sufficient to give the user some scaffolding to begin with. So the machine learning models are pretty standard. The classification models, I think we use the random forest among with others to test which one is best performance. But among the features, we use several features that included the textual features, basically the distribution of the important terms. And we use a tool called Look that is going to appear in the later work as well. It helps you to calculate some linguistic features that also related to some of the psychological, psycholinguistic characteristics of how people are expressing their content, and politeness, and some conversational features, basically how the thread is structured and how the position of the individual comments in the position of this whole thread. So using this classification techniques, we're able to help identify this different structured argumentation structures more effectively. So we perform a user study to see how they're going to react to the issue contents that is annotated by the specific argumentation components. So it is quite positive received. They think that this kind of possibility of hiding this, even at a very rudimental level, they can hide the non-argumentative content from the argumentative content is already very effective for them to determine the community opinions. And there's some quote from them, so that you can see that from the 87 threads I showed in the earlier examples, it can be pinpointed to several specific argumentative threads. And the second point they raised is that they found the separation of arguments is very useful. So this is something I haven't mentioned before. And a lot of time when the threads converge, there's a lot of times that the topics also try to diverge to different things. So having those boundaries clearly indicated, so they know that if they are at a certain point, what are the surrounding comments are relevant to their current target. So this is something that they think can be improved comparing to current issue, the plain GitHub issue discussion tool. And the third point, they also raise certain concerns. So you can see that in our argumentation models, even though we use a simplified model, we only have the warrant and the ground and the claim. It is still, if you annotate all of them, use color coding, it can be overwhelming for the users. So we have to think about from a UI design perspective in the future, if you want to provide the information to them, what is the best way to do so? So this is some of the previous work. We have been aiming to support the end users when they try to communicate with the developers about their usability concerns. But I asked you at the beginning, what kind of ways to approach the developers? And the ways to go to the GitHub is not intuitive to the vast number of end users to begin with. So in order to reach the bigger population who are not comfortable of even bothered to register a GitHub account and start to directly interact with the other people who have more extensive background communicating the open source software, we're thinking that we need to find where the most end users is going to reach. So this is another study that we try to find the user forums and to understand how the end user actually behaves in those different places. So this is forum that end user facing, and they don't have a lot of discussions, for example, the solutions discussions or use cases over there, but they are more about the problems the end users have and how to solve these problems without talking too much about implementation details. So those forums, we select 4 open source projects, including some of the one you mentioned before, Zoteros and L.C and Audacity and RStudio. And we try to understand what kind of content is left there and by whom. So we categorize the forum users to 3 categories, including the organization users who are fulfilling our organizational roles for those different projects, the developer roles. So we identify those by comparing their usernames on those user forums to their GitHub accounts. And the vast majority you can see is the EU column, which is the end users. So if you compare the ratio, the EU versus non-EU ratio, it is huge. So that you can understand how labor intensive if the organizers or the developers try to answer all the questions by the end users. So we did analysis to see what kind of conversations is happening over there. Yeah, look, no questions?
Yeah, just wondering what's the difference between org and dev? It's like management versus
Yes, yeah, basically is. So organizers, they are normally fulfilling with the organization, some logistics, some of fundraising, more on this side. And the users, the developers is more that they are contributor for the code base. But sometimes there's overlappings as well.
Got it. Thanks.
No problem. So we see three categories of actions they make. The first action is to post, basically to initialize a new post. And you can see that most of the initial posts is performed by the end users. This is pretty intuitive. The end user this is end user forum. So if that problem, they want to get their problem solved, they come here to post their questions. And organizers also sometimes post. This is mostly about the announcement. So they have a new version release. They have some helps from the end user to ask. So they post their code. The developers, this is really different from the GitHub. They play a more relatively minimum role compared to the GitHub. So the second type of action is to reply their original post. So if they post something, if some other people give them some comments, they come back and check. And sometimes they come, sometimes they don't. We also observe a high abandon rate from those forums. So they post, but they never show up to respond to their original problem. And again, a lot of the end user come back, but we have a big base to start with. So this is not surprising either. And the third action is to reply the questions, the post from others. And organizer roles still play a big part on this because they are the one who are like more end user facing. They're helping them to solve their problems. But to our encouragement, the end users play actually a huge role. It's more than half than in two of the forums to help other end users to solve their problems. So this is really encouraging. And traditionally, if we consider the end user who are not contributing the code base, you feel that they are basically invisible, but they are actually part of the community. They are helping within this community in their own ways. So after this level of analysis, we also use a tool called Look, as you've probably seen in the previous slides. It's the LIWC. It's a tool developed in Europe and basically use the linguistic features and to understand their psychological processes. So we use the Look tool to identify several categories that is really informing what kind of process the end users go through and how that might be different compared with the organizers and the developers. So I'm going to just highlight three observations. The first category is called tone. And this tone is basically the emotional tones of the text. So if the higher value represents their more positive or upbeating styles, and the lower score reveals that they are more anxiety, sadness, or hostility. So the highlight is that the end user, even though they are more tending to have a neutral in their tone, but they are more upbeating compared to the developers and organizers. And the second category is affective processes. So again, this category indicates how the user express their emotions. So it's not only about their tones reflect their emotions, but how they explicitly express their emotions in their post. And they also reveals how an individual might coping with an event. And we observe that the end user express more positive emotions than negative emotions, even though they are the parties who are expressing the issues and the negative outcome of using the software. So those are the positive side. There's another categories also give us something that to reflect, which is called cloud. And this category means that amount of expertise and confidence a forum user possesses, reflected in their post. If there's a lower score, it indicates that they are more likely to use a tentative, anxious voice. So our result indicates that end user, again, even though they are upbeat, expressing a more upbeat tone, they express more positive emotions, but they also are more humble, but at the same time express lowest confidence than the other two groups in the forum. Even though you might say that this is normal, they don't have expertise of the tools, why would they express more confidence? But if you think about the contributors who are contributing the code base, what kind of levels of confidence they might have when they are working with a bigger community versus the end users, even though they are helping the other end users, they are making their feedbacks to the team, but they're using a less confidence tone. You're probably going to think about, are we consider them as part of community as we should be? So this is a message I hope that we can think a little bit deep, what kind of ways we might be approaching to sustain the end users in the OSS community. So there are several other findings in our paper. For example, as I mentioned, they have very high rate to abandon their own posts that they initialized in the first place. And also, and a lot of times that they are just one-time users, they come and they just leave, they don't come back again. So those are all the things that we, as open source software researchers, we want to understand, can we sustain them better so that the whole community can thrive in long term and the software can have better usability. So we did some effort to understand them by interview directly the end users and also the designers. So let me just illustrate several things that we have observed, and then we synthesize them into a set of design guidelines to engage the end users. So we have several target challenges currently prevent us from engaging the end users, including the inclusiveness I mentioned, and some other aspects like learnability and mindset and how people are consider the importance of end users and transparency because of the barriers of the technical background. A lot of times the underlying development artifacts is not accessible to them. So because of those issues, we came up with 5 design guidelines for to support the open source end users, including the open source end users should easily learn how to collaborate on the project. So they probably don't need to have to go through all the hassles. It should be something very intuitive without very sophisticated technical background they should be able to use. And they should interact with the OSS team through asynchronous discussions, and they should be able to draw attention to current usability issues they face, and their contribution should be recognized. So these are very, very important. Recognition and appreciation are something that currently are vastly lacking in most of the open source projects we have seen. And they should feel motivated to collaborate with the project. And those on the user side also interviewed the open source designers who are the very direct allies to the end users. They represent as a representative for the users. So to support the designers, we also try come up with those guidelines. So the designers need to be easily to engage with end users and understand their needs. The system integrates the design process of practice into the existing development pipeline. So you probably can see that the current open source, it is very good to version control your source code, but it has very limited support for the design artifacts, and the connection integrations with the design tools is basically not there, and some other aspects as well. So we follow those guidelines. We follow a very iterative process, and actually the main effort is done by Jocelyn, who's leading figure of this project. So Jazz has come up with this initial prototype, and we have been through an iterative process with all those interviewees I mentioned earlier, and we come up this prototype. So our vision of how to engage the end users into open source projects. So you can see that it is included in 7 big steps, and I would like to highlight several things. And several is really aligned with the design guideline we talked about before. So on the end user side, we want them to think that providing problems or some of their personal issues can be considered as a contribution. So they are part of the team. And if they join the team as end users, their effort can be recognized by the whole community. And so those are the things that also we want to make it explicit. If you are an end user, there is a place for you. It is right here. You can make a click of button, you can do it. And several other efforts on the design artifact side. So if you see on the right, that is the step 4, we want to create a space so that the end users and designers can communicate those design ideas that is different than the source code-based discussion, which is more developer-oriented. And we want to make some transparencies so that the progress can be tracked and they can be easily integrated into the other development pipelines so that we can have the traceability of all those progress and end users know that their contribution has an outcome. So this is the effort we have trying to make, and Jaslyn and me and collaborators are currently trying to see that by having those tools, is it something that is really going to empower the end users? So empowerment is a very important topic. It is directly related to the different levels of motivations they might have. So even if we have tools, if there's something that the mindset cannot be changed, they don't feel empowered, they're not going to use it in long term. So we are trying to explore this and through some design workshops that we hope to put out in the summer. Okay, so this is on the usability side. And yeah, I would like to pause a little bit to see if people have any questions until I move the gear to talk about another topic. All right. Okay, so if you don't have question to me, I have a question for you, okay? So I'm going to talk about documentation. And before I talk about the documentation, I'm specifically talking about documentation for machine learning. So I'm going to ask you, since you're a CS and we have a strong machine learning program here, and a lot of you probably have interacted with machine learning algorithm before, if not developing it yourself. So have you developed a machine learning model before?
Yes.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, thank you. And I see the raised hand, a lot of yeses from the chat. So this is great. And if you answer yes, there's more questions. Have you shared your models with others? Anyone, it can be a teammate, it can be public. Yes.
Yes.
This is awesome. Yeah. So you are making impact. And let me see the next question. Have you documented your model? And if so, how did you document it?
Comments in the code.
Comments in the code? Okay, yeah. So what kind of things that you decide to put it in the comment?
Yeah, hyperparameters, explaining what layers you used.
Right. So some of the development aspects that if people want to retrain, for example, those are things helpful. Anything else? Okay, Justine mentioned that the collab type tutorial, so you probably have the whole pipeline. This is the data pre-processing, cleaning, something like that. Diksha mentioned about README file. Yeah, so those are a lot of different practices you have done. And I think this is a great starting point. And most of you have answered yes, also document your code. Okay, so the remaining part of my talk, I really want to emphasize the importance of documentation. And because the machine learning code you have put in there, if you want to transform it into the production, it is going to be embedded like 2 to 5%. Okay, so the vast code or infrastructure to support the system to work is going to be the data pipelines, the service infrastructure, the monitoring, all those things. And in order for your system, the machine learning models, to seamlessly work with others, you really have to think about how the others is going to use your model. So this is directly embedding a system. And if you release your machine learning model into a service, you probably are going to not only help having the documentation to read by your team members, you're going to let it read by the outside world, if you have ever released a model on Hugging Face, for example. So this is going to lead a big accountability problem. So accountability means that acknowledgement and assumption of responsibility and answerability for actions, decisions, products, and policies. So accountability has been very important for traditional software already. And the machine learning, the little piece, the 2 to 5 piece, because of the undeterministic nature, it really poses new challenges for accountability. So on the smaller sense, because the machine learning code actually is a combination of the data, of the code, and the models that you have trained through those different process, and the data are coming from humans, and the humans, there are different kind of humans engaged in this process. On the very, very lowest level, you have to be able to explain what's going on in the code in order to even start talking about accountability. And the scope is bigger, actually. And if certain things happens, there will be different parties who are responsible to enable for the system in the end accountable, right? And we are not only responsible for the system put in there. We have to think about all those technical, social aspects if we put it and it makes bigger impact. So to a bigger sense, accountability is also connected to fairness, explainability, auditability, responsibility, accuracy, etc. So all those different properties are related to how accountable the system in the end is going to be in production. So I think this is some work published by a bunch of people at FACT conference in 2020. And accountability, because it's overarching concepts that is related to a lot of different properties, how are we going to approach them? So they proposed this kind of framework, borrow from a different discipline that traditionally the accountability is very important. And among those, I would like to just focus, we have to start from somewhere. So let's start with the models that we are most familiar with. So for the models, the model card that is in the middle, the blue circles, the blue rectangle here, is something that if you're developing models, you probably need to think about how to model your code, how to document your code so that other people can use it with sufficient reasoning. So the model card proposal is a work that posted in 2019 about how to document your machine learning models for sharing. And include a lot of categories, and some of categories you mentioned already, including the parameters and the training processes. Those are important, but there's other information that are often overlooked. For example, the intended use, including what are the intended primary use case of your machine learning models, but also the out of scope use cases. So this is very important. You probably won't just buy a medicine that to treat certain disease to use it for different disease, right? So a lot of those work that proposed for models or data is also borrowed from this field. So it's like the instructions that you have to follow it, otherwise you are holding the responsibility. So there's other aspects about the factors. For example, if your data, for example, is deviated from original distribution, then you are going to potentially have the models perform subpar. And also there's other aspects, the ethical considerations, caveats, and recommendations. Those are the things that people should start to put into their mind when they document their model. So this work has been pretty influential in terms of how to documenting the machine learning models. That's posted there in 2019. It got more than 500 citations, if I remember correctly, in the past years. Have people adopted? As a matter of fact, if you're using Hugging Face, now the documentation for the model posted there is called model card. But this is a big but. If you look at how their model card has been documented, what kind of content is included in those model card, it is far behind the model card proposal that we see in the previous slide. So me and Amnesh and a lot of other collaborators, together we did an empirical study and to see the model, how they are documented, that potentially can be shared. So we have collected from different sources. Hugging Face is one of the important one because they call their model documentations model card. And we also searched GitHub, the model card keyword, to see the model card put it there on GitHub. And using Google search to see some of the companies, they release their model cards, I think, from Google, from Salesforce, some other places. The details is in our paper. And also as a baseline, we also try to see that the models, they have documentation, but they don't just call it model card, but they have decent effort into the model documentation. So we develop a rubric basically to evaluate their quality of their model documentation and comparing with the model card. And to give it a rating from 0 to 1, and you can see that they are far behind on specifically the categories in ethical considerations. And they did a decent job, especially for the GitHub model card and the company ones, for information like the evaluation processes, training processes, and those are the things that, as we have already discussed, it is pretty intuitive. But for the why they are evaluating it in certain ways, they fall far behind. And the intended use, especially out of scope use, how to use for those categories and the ethics I mentioned, it is far from being there. So machine learning documentation is not quite good yet. And the practice is still far behind from the proposal. Can we do better? I don't think those people who are document, they are the parties who need to have all those full blames. And currently we don't have a very good efficient tools to support people to document their models. So those we can consider something that we can work on. So drawing from richer literatures about designing the tools specific for documentation and for other technology, we have come up with 3 design guidelines. And the first guideline is inspired by the psychology. I don't know if you are familiar with Csikszentmihalyi's work, psychology Csikszentmihalyi of flow. And some other people actually in the technology, knowledge intensive work, they have proposed that the tools, they should make the flow better. So they should have limited context switching so that you can maintain in the environments that the relevant information is at hand. So the first guideline, what we propose, drawing from the literature, is that the documentation environment should be co-located with the coding environment where the related context is directly accessible. And the second guideline, we derive them from the theory of digital nudging. And if you have read some books from economics, behavioral economics, you know that the nudging idea is basically to, instead of using policies to enforce people behaviors, but you can design environment so that the preferred behavior can be easily done, but the unpreferred behavior can have a lot of obstacles. So basically following this principle, our design guideline is that the important but often overlooked content for machine learning model documentation should be prompt during the model development and documentation writing. And the third one is following the principle of single source of truth, because based on our experience and a vast literature on software documentations, the outdatedness, incorrectness are biggest problems for documentation. So that in order to make sure that content is always up to date and accurate to reflect what is going on in the code, the content should be derived or traced to the origin of information such as the source code, comments, markdown cells in the notebook, etc. So following those principles, we have built a tool for the data scientist in their notebook environment. So our tool basically is integrated into, as a prototype, so it's integrated into the Jupyter Lab. So click a button, we can open this tool. So basically this tool is going to open a facade that is what the end user is supposed to read this documentation. It's a facade of model code. And in order to nudging them to consider the different categories of model code that constantly overlooked when you are in the mode of development. So at that time, that try to improve the performance probably is your most concern, and all the other things might be out of your mind. We're trying to nudging them to consider those. So we're having those different categories, leave it side by side with your notebook, and the explanation is there, and some examples is also one link, one click, you can reach to those examples as exemplars. And when people are finishing with their model card added, we also do a very simple check. If certain important content is not fulfilled, we just prompt them to ask them, are you really want to exit? You probably need to consider again, because those information are very important, but it's still not there. And following the third principle, we want to make the code traceable so that we understand what the information is derived from. So for all the code cells that is belonging to certain machine learning stages, either it's cleaning or hyperparameter tuning or training, etc., we allow them to annotate the source code cells to those stages. And after they annotate it, we allow them to navigate it into in their model card visual panel, so that they can examine if the code align with what they document, so that their content is always, at least we have some support to validate their content. So we did a user study to evaluate the necessity of all those different functions and how easy it is. And overall, the participants have used our tools, liked all those features, and they think they're extremely important. And we also did the comparison with a control group who just developed them in their traditional settings, the plain notebook lab without our plugins. And we observed an important behavior change for their documentation purpose. When using the tool, we observed that the participants, they chose, we have a very limited time for them to in the remote settings to perform some tasks, but using the limited time, they devote more effort into different activities that is more related to the documentation. That is missing when people are more focusing on the development mode that is emphasized on the code contribution. They did more activities, including improving the writing of the existing content of documentations, creating and maintaining the code documentation trace links, and go over the model card explanations and to ponder if they're relevant to their models or not. So this is very positive observations for us. And in the long term, we believe those kind of behavior change might bring longer impact to the developers and in the end to the people who are going to have their stakes impact by those machine learning models. Okay, so I spent a lot of time talking about those projects. I hope that by introducing my two lines of work related to the usability and the documentation, you start to think from a stakeholder perspective. I think that is the biggest takeaway I hope you would have from this. So all of our work is going to impact certain people, and those peoples are going to be the stakeholder of our work. And we not only have first-hand stakeholders, sometimes those stakeholders, how they behave is going to impact a broader scope, that is the secondary stakeholders. So we hope that the kind of works you are in the end going to put there is going to become enablers to a bigger range of stakeholders, but not only the developers, for example, even though they are important, but the end users and different kind of end users, for example, the people who lack the technical expertise, or in the machine learning cases, the people whose benefit might be at stake when the machine learning is not properly considered the ethical aspects going to put there, they are going to enable their voice being heard during the whole process. So thank you for everybody's attention. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach me, or we have the audience, two of the students. I lead the two lines of work, Jacqueline and Avinash, and I'm very privileged to work with them, and also my other amazing collaborators and students. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jin.
Thank you.
Very interesting talk at the intersection of programming and psychology and like organizational behavior and stuff. I have a question regarding like, what do you see in the ecosystem, like what kind of organizations, or rather like in different open source projects, you know, we talked about VS Code. This has the backing of Microsoft, you know,
Yes.
and paid employees and stuff. And in my mind, right now, I assume most of open source software is actually, it doesn't have a big organization behind it, probably only has 1 or 2 developers. And so all this accessibility stuff is additional work for these. So do you have any comments regarding that? Like, do you see, I would assume like much less attention paid to these kind of issues when you have small teams or volunteers, stuff like that?
Right. Yeah, I think this is a great point. And this is also why we do this kind of research, because first of all, for the issue tracking systems, for the smaller team, they have less effort to constantly monitor and prioritize the issues that they face because they have very limited resources. So that's why we post those kind of scaffolding techniques so that they, even though lacking of the expertise, they can have some support to understand the usability issues, especially the important usability issues, and they can weigh the evidence because of those support. And also for the design side, and currently our work is trying to bridge the connections between the designers and also the end users. And those are also very helpful for the smaller team, because for the big team, you can consider the Microsoft, they have their professional designers who not necessarily need to be an open source designer, and they can use the vast majority of efforts. They can recruit the people, the end users by different means to understand the user needs better. But for the other side of the spectrum, actually, this is a long tail effects. Vast majority of open source projects, they don't have this kind of resource. But if they have this channel more streamlined, they're able to make this connection with the end users better, so that their products, the usability can be more improved. So that's why we think they can benefit over the board, especially benefit the smaller projects.
Have you reached out to GitHub at all to incorporate your tools?
No, we haven't. So currently we're actually building some tools to improve the issue discussions. So Amnesh and several other students, undergrad students, they are amazing. They have done a great job to work with a Chrome plugin, so that the discussions between the different stakeholders can be better promote, and also the information, different kind of information can be more salient to people. So we haven't reached out to, this is some research projects. It is a little bit behind in terms of transforming into some products with it, which is normally not our aim, but we want to inspire more people into this. And we don't want to marry to GitHub. This is something that I like to emphasize, because we want to have a more inclusive environment, and not necessarily GitHub, not necessarily people who are familiar with all those whole ecosystem. So the overall concepts and frameworks, no matter what kind of other framework people are using, I hope they can benefit as well.
Yeah, it does feel like GitHub has like the monopoly on like issue tracking, stuff like that.
Yes, indeed. Any other questions?
Just another comment regarding like, I don't know if you touched upon that or not, but like being able to, in the software itself, raise issues to the teams, you know, instead of having to go through GitHub. For example, like often I'm just on a web page, you know, and you see a typo. And I'm like, I don't want to like send an email just because there's like a tiny typo, but it would be so awesome if I could like overline it with the like right click or something and click like announce typo or something. Like, how do you know, features like that.
Right, this is a great point. And I have been actually discussing this with my collaborator and my postdoc for a while. And we have seen there is a reporting mechanisms on GitHub, a lot of the softwares. And for example, you can click a button to report the crash. And sorry, there's some, hi, there's some play dates going on. Hello. So yeah, sorry, yeah. Can you wait for me to finish it?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. All right. This is what happens if you have a play date for your kids and you're happening to want to give a talk. So yeah. All right. That's actually, my the best friends of my son, so they're having a play date. Anyways, I've been having a lot of fun with them before the talk. So yeah, I would like to comment on the ideas you mentioned. So we have a lot of the reporting mechanisms for the different kind of issues. For example, it is crash or I think this is a great idea, but what is currently still missing that prevent people from always using it is the appreciation and recognition. So those aspects, I think, is currently we don't have a good mechanism to integrate them to software as well. A lot of time it's a sense of community that encourages you to come back. And if it's just click button, you're going to, it's like a throw a needle in the hay and you won't know whether it's going to make a difference. Even though it is a click, a lot of people just choose not to do it. So I think that it's really the key. So things can be closer to the end users, like in the software. I think that is something we hope to approach, but also we want to bring the community also closer. But how to do that is something that I think in the coming years, we're going to also explore.
Yeah, it's very intimidating to open tickets online, you know?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, especially when the rest of the crowd is people who are touching the code base, that seems more hardcore. This is the mindset aspects that we have observed a lot of time. People think that open source, this is something not difficult. If you find it not satisfying, you should submit the change to the code. But this is not the case for a lot of people.
Yeah. But you see some gatekeeping, you know, like
yes.
My stereotype of it is like somebody open an issue on GitHub and then the developer will be like, no, this is not a real problem. Or like, why do you want to do that? And just
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's why I think inclusiveness is really a key for the sustainability of the community.
Cool.
Have you seen any way, this is a little bit of a far-fetched question, so pardon me, Jin, but have you seen any transferability in different forums that have a similar format? Because you'll see now these, not necessarily Stack Overflow, but like Math Overflow is one, and you have them like, I'm sure, for sewing and chess and all these like sub communities. Have you been able to see if anything, like if it's kind of the same domain, or do you think this is a little bit different?
I think this is a great point. Different community, they're having their more go-to tools. So for example, the developers go to the Stack Overflow and for certain kind of questions. And if it's specific for the software that they want the development team to do something, they might go to the GitHub. And for the end users, a lot of time they use the Slack, Discord, and sometimes the user forum as well. So I think in the end, it's still some of the instrumentations across those platforms can be important, because I think Jazz also during the interview, the designers raised the concern that these are different places. They don't know where to find. And even the conversation happened there, they don't know how to master the content and migrate it into a different platform. So that's why in the prototype, we try to raise, even though you see the overall design is following the GitHub, it's because what has been used, where all those management has been going on, we want to integrate there so that you have a more central place to manage all those different kind of information so that they can maintain easier the traceability links. But I think it's very challenging problems. I think a lot of the NLP techniques people have proposed over there, potentially they can identify useful informations and put it around. But in order to have real breakthroughs, I think we need really the tools, the frameworks that can bridge in those different platforms.
Is there also a language barrier? As in like most of GitHub would be in English, I would assume.
This is another great point. And currently we're unfortunately only focusing the English speaking languages. Actually in language, I think I know some works about inclusiveness that they talk about people who are using English as a second language, and they got discriminated because of their language barrier. But the culture-wise and language-wise, how to be broadly more inclusive, I think the tools need to have those kind of combinations, and also human side. If we start to have a more inclusive community, I think this is also a good benefit snowballing effects so that people can appreciate those aspects more. But currently, I think this is not there yet, far from there. I think our effort is maybe more like scratching the surface, raise the awareness level, but in terms of more practical tools to improve the diversity in terms of culture and language, it is a little bit behind.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Because we're tackling these same issues in the real world, you know, like not that GitHub is separate from the real world, but it impacts everything really.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Well, I think I'm out of questions.
Yeah, I think most of other people's are probably from my lab, so a lot of them. So if you have other people, if you have any questions, feel free to speak up. If not, anytime if you are interested in the things going on, feel free to talk with the people. So out here, Jazz, Avinash, and also I see, Justin, Diksha, Fuyan, so all those people, they can answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Jin.
Thank you for the invitation. It's great fun, and thank you for the great set of questions.
No worries, it was my pleasure.
Louis,
Thank you.